Welcome, everybody. Those of you who are here and those of you who are joining in the next few minutes and hopefully over the next 5-10 minutes. This is our revitalized peer-to-peer network monthly topic and speaker program. Today, we're lucky to have Dr. Rebecca French, who will speak on progress towards implementing the recommendations of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, including processes improving equity and environmental justice and climate planning. These topics for the last several years, for the time that peer-to-peer has been getting together, have been always, top of mind and of interest, but just recently, much more so. So this is extremely timely that Dr. French can be here. A little bit of background on Rebecca. She's the director of the Office of Climate Planning at Connecticut DEP. She advises the Deep Commissioner on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience plans across all divisions of the agency, including administering the Governor's Council on Climate Change and implementing its recommendations. Previously, Dr. French served as Director of Resilience for the Connecticut Department of Housing, overseeing the $64.3 million grant awarded to the state through HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition, as well as the Rebuild by Design pilot project in Bridgeport, and as the Director of Community Engagement for the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, CIRCA, great acronym, where she translated science and engineering to help communities, state and local government, private industry, and academic partners implement solutions to a changing climate and extreme weather while strengthening resilience through economic development policies and social cohesion. So it gives me great pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca French and have her share her screen. A couple of quick logistical and housekeeping topics. We're going to let everybody mute themselves. Although I was a bit slow just a few minutes ago, but I have the capacity to mute people if need be. I would request that Rebecca said she'll take questions during this, which would be great. So if you have a question, raise your hand using the raise your hand function, which is down under reactions. To me, that's more of an action. But if it's under reactions, you can raise your hand and I will recognize you. I'll ask Rebecca and then you can unmute yourself. And then when we go into the general Q&A, try to remain muted when you're not speaking or asking a question or having a discussion. And that way, and I'll recognize people and just put them in the order that they need to be in. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. As you said, there are definitely familiar names, faces on here, folks who I know who've been working in the climate resilience space, especially my colleague, Michelle Halou from Department of Housing, who is part of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and Kathy, who's a member of the working group. So we've got people who I will try to not repeat things or quickly touch on things that I'm sure folks are already familiar with and spend more time on the bit of the policy weeds, which I think this group would be interested in. So I'm going to share my screen. So again, I'm going to be talking about Governor's Council on Climate Change recommendations. I'm going to touch on some climate impacts today, as well as some policies implementing recommendations from the Governor's Council on Climate Change. For those of you who are new to the Governor's Council on Climate Change, or we call it the GC3 for short, it is under Executive Order 3, which was launched in September 2019 with Governor Lamont, and Commissioner Dykes, Commissioner of DEP, serves as the chair of the GC3. And Governor Lamont expanded the purview of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. There was previously a GC3 that focused on the first objective, which was provide recommendations and monitoring and reporting on greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies. But the governor expanded that to include development and implementation of adaptation strategies to assess and prepare for the impacts of climate change. And so today when I'm speaking, I'm using the word mitigation. I'm referring to reducing emissions, stabilizing levels of heat trapping greenhouse gases, as opposed to natural hazard mitigation, which is sometimes used interchangeably with adaptation and resilience. So just clarifying that. And so the adaptation, I'm talking about the means adjustment in natural human systems in anticipation of or response to a changing environment. And resilience means the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions, withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. In this case, we're talking about global warming and climate change. GC3 was separating the two subcommittees under those two major objectives, but the bulk of the work was done in these working groups, and you can read them here. Particularly going to note the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group that I'm going to focus on some of their recommendations today. And this was done because of an equity lens that the governor wanted all the recommendations to be seen through an equity lens. And so that working group helped us with that. And then we had all these other working groups that came up with sort of recommendations under each sort of mitigation and resiliency. And we also had a science and technology working group that did climate impacts, and I'm going to summarize some of those today as well. This is our sort of summary slide of the overall GC3 process that happened over the course of 2020. We had 231 working group members representing over 100 organizations. They held 186 meetings, most of them over Zoom, because we were in the middle of the GC3 process when the state government went completely remote for under the stay safe, stay home executive order issued in March with the onset of the pandemic public health emergency. And the culmination of that work was this report, Taking Action on Climate Change and Building a More Resilient Connecticut for All, which was released in January 2021. And includes summaries of the work of the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group and defining the equity lens, the impacts of climate change, as well as 61 recommendations, most of which have multiple sub recommendations under them. So it's really more like 200 plus individual actions that we can take to advance action on climate change in Connecticut. So I encourage you to look at that report if you've not done so already. Everything I'm talking about can be found there. So I'm going to quickly highlight some of Connecticut's vulnerability to climate change with a bit of a focus on what's happened this summer. So the important message here on the relationship between mitigation and adaptation. So, it's important to understand that these things are really connected, right? When we talk about what has releasing greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere done? Well, we have already changed the climate based on past emissions. And so those past emissions are going to keep impacting us through the year 2050. And so the science is very clear that there's high confidence on what the impacts will be to Connecticut, the nation, the world, now through 2050 based on past emissions. So and that those are largely baked into our system. So we really have to adapt to anything that we can project out to 2050. But the good news is that after 2050, the further impacts of climate change very much depend on the emissions decisions we make now. So there's a time lag there. So we have the opportunity to reduce emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the IPCC report that came out just a few weeks ago underscored that again, and that we can start seeing the lessening of impacts from climate change within my lifetime by reducing emissions now, but it's got to be drastic and it's got to be fast. And so I always want to underscore to people when I talk about resilience, the most important resilience strategy is reducing emissions and preventing further damage. But you still need to understand that our climate has fundamentally changed and we do have to deal with those impacts as well. So these are some of the impacts, again, that are already baked into our climate because we did not reduce emissions when I was a kid. We have stronger storms with more wind and rain, more frequent and longer droughts, up to 20 inches of sea level rise along the Connecticut coast by 2050. as a result of that sea level rise and increased frequency of flooding with levels like those seen in Superstorm Sandy every 5 to 10 years. Indices of extreme rainfall across the board increase. And we expect to see an increased frequency of 90 degrees, days over 90 degrees, where we were an average of a baseline of the years 1970 to 1999 of 5 per year to up to 25 per year by mid-century. And with those increasing 90 degrees days, again, increased frequency of heat waves comes along with that. And we saw some of that in June. So I'm not aware if the scientists have done an analysis of whether the heat wave we experienced in Connecticut this summer, like the fingerprinting of that to climate change. So what I'm sharing here is really, this is in line with the trends. And so the kinds of our experience from this summer is indicative of what we can expect to see more of as we go into future decades in Connecticut. So we had our first heat wave this summer in June of 2021. It was when school was still in session. So between that extreme heat and protocols we have in place to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, a lot of schools decided to close because they didn't have air conditioning, or they just thought it wasn't a safe conditions for the kids. And so we had that sort of outside impact of having a heat wave when we usually, historically would not have experienced heat waves in June. And it turns out that along with heat waves come poor air quality days. So that same weekend we DEP released the first air quality alert of 2021, hitting southeastern coastal Connecticut. And the hot conditions make for just the right way to form ground level ozone, which of course exacerbates asthma and anyone with sort of chronic underlying health conditions. So it was a very serious impact of both that heat and poor air quality. Elsa kicked off July for us in Connecticut. And, these are some images. I think upper right here is downtown Meriden, Connecticut. I think the bottom here is maybe Stamford, an underpass in Stamford. And just, I think on the left is a manhole cover in Middletown. So just seeing the intense impacts of what is a rainfall storm. This is not coastal flooding. This is from rainfall only. And then I'm going to share a clip here from New Haven taken and just during Tropical Storm Elsa.
Well, Elsa was too much for New Haven's drainage system, leaving parts of the city underwater this morning.
Channel 3 Eyewitness News reporter Mike Savino is live right now from the Elm City. Mike, how are things looking tonight?
Well, Mark and Irene, things cleared up pretty quickly once the rain got out and the city's drainage system was able to catch up. But there are still some lingering areas where they're trying to recover. And so we have some city staff here at the Emergency Operations Center who are continuing to watch.
When there's so much water coming in the pipes, the stormwater pipes are just not big enough to hold that capacity.
Tropical Storm Elsa didn't bring much in the form of wind to the Elm City, but it dumped a lot of rain, more than 4 inches, including 2 inches during 1 hour this morning. That caused a lot of flooding problems, and not just in the normal areas like along the coast or on Quinnipiac Avenue. The rain was too much for the city's drainage system, and flooding became a problem everywhere.
Never saw the manhole covers, never saw the water coming up from below like this.
Howard Foreman shot this video shortly before 9 while walking his dog. You can see the water rushing through the intersection of Temple and George Streets.
I feel like I got essentially a pool in my backyard, so a lot of flooding, at least in my area.
Flooding in some areas went down almost immediately once the rain ended, and the drainage system caught up quickly. But luckily, the rain ended before high tide and before the winds picked up. Officials say there were only 300 power outages reported in the city. But Mayor Justin Ellicker and his staff say the storm is a warning of what could happen in the future. Water levels are rising, meaning the drainage system could become slower, especially at high tide. Fixing that will require major investments.
As a coastal community, that is a very big concern for us. It's going to require a lot of investment and analysis.
Now, Elliker says one of the things that the city is looking to do right now is get more bioswales into the sidewalks. Now, those are sections of the sidewalks that are actually able to absorb the water and keep it from going into the street in the first place. They're also working with the Army Corps of Engineers to come up with a plan to protect the Long Wharf section of the city. Live from New Haven, Mike Savino, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
So thanks for watching that clip with me. I like that because, I'm always out here talking about the impacts of climate change and storms. And I think it means so much more to hear it from a mayor, from municipal staff, from people, who live in the community talking about what they saw. You heard multiple issues, touched on there of basically an extreme storm combined with aging infrastructure, combined with, also how sea level rise ties into impacting the ability of the infrastructure to deal with the rainfall. And the kinds of investments. And then they also highlighted two investments at the end there, the bioswales, which we call sort of a green infrastructure or nature-based solution as a way to absorb more rainfall and keep it from going into the gray infrastructure or the pipes and the conveyance system. And then they touched on what the Long Wharf protection system, which is a proposal in with Army Corps to build a major flood wall along basically parallel to 95's waterward of 95 and protect that whole area of Long Wharf, which historically actually was open water, but we filled it in the 1800s and built 95 across it along with a lot of other things. And so now it's very prone to flooding because it was at one point open water. So that's just, indicative of what's happening in New Haven, but that story can be told along all of our coastal cities. And so here's again, the tie-in to the mitigation and adaptation, right? So these are all things that we have to adapt to. What New Haven was dealing with, those are all things that we have to adapt to. But what we can do is keep them from getting much worse. So if because the temperatures and sea level rise, they are sensitive to policy choices and carbon dioxide emissions. They are sensitive to lowering emissions. Their trajectory is not set. And so, but if we don't take an action, the sea level rise will continue after 2050. It could, simulations include, going up to 80 inches by the end of the century. And temperature is also sensitive. We know that temperatures will stabilize. Those are actually some of the impacts that we could see within my lifetime with drastically reduced emissions. We'll see a stabilizing of the temperature. But if we don't do that, we expect to see warming accelerate. And so what is Connecticut's contribution to the mitigation path? Connecticut has 3 targets in statute that the state legislature has told the state we need to reach these in order to do our part, to reach national goals. Connecticut's targets are in line with the national targets set by the Biden administration. We have a 2020 target of a 10% reduction below 1990 levels, at 45% below 2001 levels by 2030, and 80% reduction by 2050. But if you've been following the news in the past week, you'll know that we released our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which is also called for in statute. This is to report to the public, to the legislature on how we're doing towards those targets. And unfortunately, we're not really on track to meet our 2030 target. 2018 there's a bit of a time lag in our emissions data, so we kind of have to wait a while for EPA to process all of the data, and then we get it and we can do a local report for the state of Connecticut. And so for the latest data we have of 2018, this is where we are. Our economy-wide emissions were 42.2 megatons of carbon. This is a decrease of 7.3% since 1990 and 17.8% since 2001. Transportation, electricity, and residential accounted for nearly 3/4 of Connecticut's greenhouse gas emissions, which you can see reflected in the graph on the right. Transportation is the one on top in blue, electricity is in green, residential is in purple. And the good news is that Connecticut is actually doing very well on our electricity. Power grid emissions dropped 35% since 2001 because we've made significant investments in energy efficiency and renewables, and also because of the ongoing use of the nuclear substation in Waterford. But emissions from transportation and buildings went up because in those sectors, vehicles and buildings are continue to be powered by fossil fuels. And I say powered, I should really say heating. The buildings heating continues to be from fossil fuels, and transportation, of course, largely being fueled by gasoline. And you can see that reflected here, both that purple line for residential going up and transportation being flat for a while, going down, having flattened for a while, but now starting to tick back up. All right, so now switching gears a little bit over into the equity lens of the Governor's Council on Climate Change recommendation. So this is taken from the IPCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which again released a report a few weeks ago that made a lot of headlines. They found that differences in vulnerability exposure arise from non-climatic factors and from multidimensional inequalities often produced by uneven development processes. These differences shape differential risks from climate change. People who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. And the heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. It's the product of intersecting social processes that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure. The social processes include discrimination on the basis of gender, class, ethnicity, age, and disability. So this was an aspect of the IPCC findings that was shared by the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group and their findings for the GC3. The working group found through the they defined the equity lens for us for looking at the recommendations of the GC3 on both mitigation and adaptation and resilience recommendations. Found that equitable planning, it includes core concepts of distributive and procedural justice. It considers existing disparities and provides communities with meaningful opportunities to participate in the policy processes meant to further climate justice and mitigate environmental racism. It requires that community perspectives and viewpoints be considered in adaptation and mitigation decision-making and planning. So this, again, with this, the GC3 is a planning process. So this lens is incredibly important, and the public participation process was incredibly important to that effort. And I understand today you're looking at some of these definitions and trying to walk over this. So again, this is from our Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group. I will know that our co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the working groups, Marian Engelman-Lotto, is considered a national leader and scholar on environmental justice. And we were fortunate enough to have her as our co-chair of this working group before she was then recruited to join the Biden administration and lead their efforts at EPA on environmental justice. So you can really take this from her and her students who were instrumental in putting together such a strong report with us. Distributive equity is defined as placing the most vulnerable communities at the forefront of any potential benefits a policy might create, ensuring that the distribution, the benefits, and the burdens of climate change are equitably distributed. Procedural equity, planning in partnership with low-income communities and BIPOC communities. Contextual equity is assessing the vulnerabilities of communities across Connecticut to climate change due to the legacy of racial and income inequality and other factors. And corrective equity is providing communities with clear processes to hold the state accountable to its commitments to pursue equity. And of course, you could sub out state with whatever entity is doing the planning process, but in this case, it's a state of Connecticut process. And this is taken from the executive order itself, which the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group was doing this in response to this. Actually, I would give a shout out to Kathy Dorgan for this image on the right here. I believe this is probably an activity that Kathy may have put together. Is this from an image that you did from the Resilient Bridgeport?
Yep,
thought so. Yeah, so we have some great pictures from that engagement with, I think, students who are part of the designing the stormwater park is what we're looking at here, a stormwater park that is getting into final design and construction in 2022. So anyways, that aside, but I wanted to give Kathy credit for that work you're seeing right here. So in Executive Order 3, it required prioritizing, integrating, and advancing equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of climate change mitigation planning policies, specifically addressing the disproportionate impacts of such strategies on environmental justice communities, and providing an adaptation and resilience plan with recommended strategies to prioritize climate change adaptation efforts to protect vulnerable communities that may be disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. And again, this was all incorporated into the phase 1 report recommendations. And so now I'm going to highlight some of those recommendations from the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group. This is a very high level summary of that work. They made recommendations to prioritize mitigation and adaptation strategies in vulnerable communities will feel the impacts of climate change first and worst through launching a statewide environmental justice mapping tool, and focusing planning resources in those communities, including developing and implementing a no less than 40% equity funding and or benefit commitment. And so now we're getting to how some of these recommendations were implemented. And I'm kind of crossing over here between, I'm highlighting some implementation actions that I think feature how equity and environmental justice in particular was incorporated into the recommendation that then resulted in this action. So this one is from the Take Back the Grid Act. If you remember back to September 2020, the state legislature in Connecticut convened a special session. It was largely in response to Isaias, which had major power outages across the state of Connecticut, huge impacts on communities in the middle of a pandemic, and really created a lot of outcry, largely about the response from the utilities. But so this proposal was put forward and passed. It was, colloquially called Take Back the Grid Act, otherwise known as Public Act 20-5, what became Public Act 20-5. And within that Take Back the Grid Act, there was an expansion of an existing program that was called the Microgrid Grant and Loan Pilot Program. We added resilience to that program so that it can more broadly support resilience projects, recognizing that we had one tool in the toolbox at DEP for grid resilience grants, and that was to build microgrids. And microgrids are an excellent strategy. They have multiple benefits, but they're also not the only thing you can do. And so we wanted to, say, hey, like, you shouldn't try to make the tool fit the problem. You should find the right, you shouldn't make the problem try to fit the tool. You should find the right tool to address your problem. And so that's why we really recommended to the legislature that they expand this, and they did. And it was, although the working group report, the GC3 recommendations were not complete, we were in the middle of that process. The development of the recommendations in this area were heavily influenced by the status and the discussions of the GC3 that have been happening all summer. So this act, it expanded the allowed uses of funding under this program, in addition to like being able to support resilience projects. That funding can now be used for community planning that includes microgrid or resilience project feasibility, including cost-benefit analyses, assistance for the cost of design and engineering services, and interconnection infrastructure for resilience projects. Resilience projects can just storage systems or certain distributed energy systems, and non-federal cost sharing for grant and loan applications that include microgrids or resilience. The first two, I want to highlight the community planning and the design and engineering. These are something we heard a lot about in the GC3 process, that, people have, a lot of municipalities have concepts of what they want to do. At least along the coastal areas, we did have quite a bit of funding for planning because of Sandy, but inland, they haven't had much money for any resilience planning. But even those communities that had concepts through community plans didn't have any support for design, for getting those from concept to really a level that you could actually apply for a federal grant or a state grant to actually build something. And that was a real barrier to actually advancing resilience. So that was how we incorporated recommendations. And then this was also the first time that we defined vulnerable communities in statute. So it was, again, vulnerable communities was how this was referred to in Executive Order 3, sometimes also using, you may have heard frontline communities, you may have heard underserved, overburdened communities. In consistency with the Executive Order 3, we used vulnerable communities, but we're talking about populations that may be disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. And we drew on these 5 different areas as ways to define vulnerable communities. Low and moderate income communities, environmental justice communities, which is defined in statute. So environmental justice communities as defined in statute elsewhere, include distressed municipalities and census blocks for which at least 30% of the population consists of low-income people who are not institutionalized and have an income below 200% of the federal poverty level. Communities eligible for the Federal Community Reinvestment Act program, which largely follows the guidance of HUD's definitions for low LMI communities, low moderate income communities, and populations with increased risk and limited means to adapt to the effects of climate change, or any others as is further defined by DEEP in consultation with community representatives. 4 and 5 were really more heavily linked. This is kind of a breakout by the Office of Legislative Research. It was important that we included these kind of a bit of a catch-all in 4 and 5, but also, again, very much taking into account what we had been hearing in the GC3 discussions, particularly from the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group, that we use a lot of census data currently, largely focused only on income, which is a very strong indicator of vulnerability, but not the only indicator. And so we really need to do that kind of work in partnership, those defining of who is vulnerable in partnership with the communities who are impacted, because they have local knowledge of what is happening in their communities that can help us build resilient solutions that make sense for them and really help those who most need the help. And so that's why we have that, particularly number 5, but also just that general thing of not all populations who are low income, or there might be other factors that are as much or more important than income that mean there's limited means to adapt to the effects of climate change. And this is the map of environmental justice communities in Connecticut as defined in statute. The communities highlighted in red here are, quote, distressed municipalities from the Department of Economic and Community Development. This is actually the 2020 list of from DECD. That the 2021 list was recently released, and interestingly, New Haven actually dropped off the list, and Groton came on the list. And so, but the data that is in addition to that distressed municipality list, which is just 25 communities, it's limited to 25 communities, is the census block data. So even within some of our very wealthy communities, we still have census tracts where there are high rates of poverty, large blocks of low-income communities. And so those areas are also considered environmental justice communities. This, I would say, is a real achievement from the Governor's Council on Climate Change process in the area of adaptation and resilience. There was a bill proposed that took multiple proposals about how to pay for resilience projects, and also pay for pay for an expanded suite of resilience projects. So really drawing across sort of multiple recommendations from the GC3, and was pulled into one bill proposed by the governor called an Act Concerning Climate Change Adaptation, which was passed. There were some amendments to it, but largely remained intact and passed Public Act 21-115. So I'm extremely proud of that our resilience, adaptation, and mitigation groups did that resulted in this getting the support to pass what was a very intense and crowded legislative session run entirely remotely, which was very interesting. There were a lot of like 24-hour hearings. I think the hearing for this bill was 12 hours. Not just this bill, but the bill where this one was discussed in committee was 12 hours long. So and I know that you're highlighting today about the community resilience recommendation. So I did want to clarify, there's a recommendation about community resilience planning as kind of a standalone recommendation from the Equity Environmental Justice Group, which is also a recommendation from the Infrastructure and Land Use Working Group. There are elements of that that could be funded through the community planning through the Microgrid and Resilience Grant and Loan Program. I would also say that the tools from the climate change adaptation also support municipalities in their efforts to enhance community resilience. So these things are, there's no single act right now or program. It's called the Community Resilience Building for Connecticut, but we're adding to the climate resilience tools as we go through here. So again, it was one law, but really had multiple proposals packed into it. So I'm going to parse it apart here and tell you about all the elements of what's in Public Act 21-115. So first, it allowed for the creation of stormwater authorities. It authorized all municipalities to have the option to create stormwater authorities. There was existing legislation passed far back as 2007 that allowed for municipalities to pilot it. Only one of those municipalities decided ultimately 11 years later to do a stormwater authority, which maybe doesn't sound like a strong vote of confidence in stormwater authorities, but I think this is my theory of what's going on here. Stormwater authorities in 2007 were kind of only being thought about through water quality issues, which is incredibly important. We have major water pollution problems. We have runoff, stormwater runoff is a major source of pollution in our waterways statewide, particularly impacting Long Island Sound. But so at that time, that's really why it was introduced. It was entirely about water quality. As the climate has changed, as we've seen increasing impacts from stormwater as a flooding issue, that has raised the interest in stormwater authorities. And in the city of New London, the only place that implemented a stormwater authority under the pilot legislation, they have told me that it was as much or more about being able to control the volume of stormwater as it was about the quality of the water quality coming out of their stormwater system. And I'll talk some more about that too. But anyway, so New London adopted this in 2018, but now all municipalities in Connecticut can do what New London did if they wish to do so. And it can again result in reductions in stormwater pollution and flooding. It allows them to be able to do green infrastructure and resiliency investments in addition to all the other actions they may need to take to update their stormwater infrastructure. And they can use it as a way to leverage additional state and federal funding sources. On the right here is an image from the city of New Haven. This is one of the bioswales that they talked about in that clip we saw. These are some students who are helping build those bioswales in New Haven. Stormwater authorities allow municipalities to set fees for stormwater. When setting those fees, they have to consider the amount of impervious cover that generates stormwater runoff. That's the real culprit in stormwater, is impervious cover, meaning pavement, roofs, anything where rainwater cannot infiltrate. And then land use types that result in higher concentrations of stormwater pollution, and a property's grand list valuation as a way to set a fee schedule. It also requires them to consider land use types that result in lower concentrations of stormwater pollution. There is it's not an exception. It's a clarification really for these land types for farm, forest, and open space land, as well as government or agency properties. It limits fees to areas with impervious surfaces from which stormwater discharges to a municipal separate storm sewer system. Not to get too much into the weeds here, but for the most part, farms, forests, and open space are areas that don't have large areas of impervious cover. And so we wouldn't expect them to be heavily assessed fees anyways. But there were concerns about that, particularly from the farming community, about how that would impact them. And then from the government or agency properties, there are, multiple sort of state entities and agencies that have separate storm sewer systems, storm sewer permits. And so this was just, clarifying that if they're not using the municipality storm sewer system, they shouldn't be paying into the municipal storm sewer system. They should be paying into the system that they're using. So that's what that was about. I'm spending some time on that because I have heard people say this is a carve out, they don't have to pay. That is not what that means. It means that, we're being very specific about the situations under which those entities have to pay. Nobody is exempted from this. Stormwater fees can be assessed on anyone, including properties that are tax exempt, have to pay into a stormwater fee if they are contributing to stormwater runoff. It also requires a partial fee reduction as a credit for stormwater best management practices that the authority approves and reduce, retain, or treat stormwater on site. This was a new addition from what was in the pilot program in 2007. And it's really an incentive. It's trying to build incentives into the program to say, because the best solution to stormwater is to do things like those bioswales. Make changes to your property that reduce impervious cover. Make changes to your property that keep the water on site as opposed to having it run off into the street and going into the storm sewer system and having those kinds of impacts we saw in New Haven of, streets flooded. So it's the best thing to do is to keep the water out of the storm sewer system. And that is a cost savings, and it's better for the environment. It results in improved water quality, as well as reducing stormwater flows and flooding. So we really wanted to try to get people to do that. And as an incentive, they can reduce fees as a result. All right, so moving on from stormwater fees, the next section was the Climate Resilience Board, which was really it's an expansion of another existing board on the books called Flood and Erosion Control Boards. And those have been around for several decades now, but they really were not brought up to where we are today with climate resilience and thinking and tools that we have now. So we've given municipalities the ability to do, we've renamed them Flood Prevention, Climate Resilience, and Erosion Control Boards, which is quite a mouthful, so I'm calling them Climate Resilience Boards. And we authorize them to undertake a wider range of climate resilience activities, including utilizing nature-based solutions, restoring natural floodplains, and reserving open space for future migration of wetlands. This is in addition to things that flood and erosion control boards can already do, which were largely flood control measures like building berms, flood walls, tide gates, dikes, anything like that, hard infrastructure, sort of flood barrier infrastructure. They already were able to do all of those things, but they didn't have any explicit authorization to use these nature-based solutions and to build nature-based solutions, and also to use conservation and restoration as tools in the toolbox, which are major recommendations from our Natural and Working Lands Working Group. The boards were also directed to consider hazard mitigation and resilience plans, which they didn't always do, or also may have not exist. They didn't really exist when we created flood and erosion control boards in the 80s. And we also directed them to prioritize vulnerable communities and to consult with the UConn Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And so that prioritization of vulnerable communities is then referring back to that statutory definition I told you about before. So these things were really building upon each other, because we'd put that vulnerable communities definition in statute in September 2020, and now we're using it again here in the legislative session in 2021. These boards can use municipal climate change and coastal resiliency reserve funds for the first time. These reserve funds were authorized in 2019 in statute, and they're just a way for municipalities to set aside dollars. This was actually an idea that came from the town of Branford and their CFO. And so it's a place for municipalities to save and better leverage their funds. And so now we've connected it to this authority to do projects. We also authorize them for entering and taking property, issuing bonds, taxing or assessing property owners, among other things, basically what you have to do in order to be able to build resilient infrastructure, whether it be nature-based or hard infrastructure. They can also establish, or I should say towns can also establish districts to implement flood and erosion control systems that now use the authority to implement flood prevention, climate resilience, and erosion control systems. Those districts, like other districts, municipalities can set up or can be special taxing districts. So you could set up a special tax district to support a climate resilience project if you wish to do so, or if a municipality wish to do so. These are all permissive, so that's really important. These are all permissive. They don't require municipalities to take any of these actions. Reporting requirements. They do have, if these boards are active, they do need to do an inventory and description of their systems. They need to report the extent and value of property infrastructure and natural resources the system protects. They need to analyze how it prioritizes and protects vulnerable communities, and also report on their revenue and expenses. This is an image of a project that is a nature-based solution. It's one of the few in the state. This is in Fenwick, which is part of Old Saybrook. And they had a dune area that's been eroding. You can see they've got a marsh area behind that. And so in order to mitigate the erosion here, they installed a living shoreline, plantings along the dune area, along with, you see the sort of piles of rocks in the little kind of horseshoe shape there. Those small piles of rocks basically break up the wave action before it hits the shore. But what they don't do is block animals from being able to move between the shore and the water, which is really important for habitat space. So when we build a seawall, we completely cut off that interface between the land and the water. This is a system that achieves breaking up of wave action, slowing down erosion, but doesn't prevent natural processes and ecosystems from surviving and thriving. So now concerning climate adaptation, this was the final part of the bill, an expansion of the Connecticut Green Bank. This is the largest expansion of the Connecticut Green Bank since it was created in 2011. And it allows the Green Bank to invest if it sees actionable opportunities in water, waste, and recycling, climate adaptation and resilience, agriculture, land conservation, parks and recreation, and environmental markets like with carbon offsets and ecosystem services. It is limited from investing projects eligible for the Clean Water Fund. The reason for that is that we have a Clean Water Fund that makes investments, so it's duplicative. So that's why they're not doing that, because we can already do it within DEP. And it allows Green Bank to utilize its bonding authority and seek federal funding to raise capital to invest in and stimulate more private investment in these types of projects, including climate adaptation and resilience projects. And it sets a maximum term of bonds issued for environmental infrastructure projects at 50 years, which I think this is a little bit outside. I'm not a banker, so maybe Rudy can jump in here if he understands this a little better than I do. But my understanding is that prior to this, the Green Bank could only issue bonds for 25 years. And so this was a doubling of that. I mean, 50 years is a long time. It's also recognizing that massive resilience projects like flood control systems for an entire neighborhood are designed to last 50 or more years. So it does make sense to have that bonding and financing authority actually match the length of the service of that kind of environmental infrastructure. And what's exciting about this is that, resilience projects right now are funded through federal dollars. They're funded through municipal bonding dollars and state bonding dollars. And so this is another financing tool now that the Green Bank can also issue bonds and use that as a way to raise capital to invest in projects, as long as there's a way to pay it back. Again, financing money means you got to pay it back. Grants, you don't have to pay back grants. So that's resilience, and I feel like I'm going to run out of time here. All right, so now I'm going to highlight a few projects about the mitigation strategies. These are programs that that we've advanced that are in line with the recommendations of the GC3. And one of them is the Equitable Energy Efficiency, or E3 programs. The DEP has been going through a recommendations and public participation process to make sure they're alleviating high energy burdens for low income and underserved households, recognizing and remediate past harms by prioritizing historically under-resourced communities, mitigate and eliminate barriers to low and moderate income participation in energy efficiency programs, drive accessible and transparent process to incorporate residents' priorities and lived experiences into program design and decision-making, and ensure equitable access to the benefits of energy efficiency. I think you can hear in these goals how much DEEP is really internalizing what we learned through the Governor's Council on Climate Change about the concerns and needs of equity, of particularly environmental justice communities, low moderate income communities, and how they, that needs to be at the table. It needs to be institutionalized as part of the way we design the programs from the get-go, and recognizing that we haven't addressed the needs of those communities in the way that we should, and owning that and trying to do, trying to make it better and trying to make sure that they're not only included, but prioritized. So, so I encourage you to sort of follow this process as it goes along and participate. They had sort of multiple meetings over the summer that's ongoing, and you can find more information on the DEP website. And sorry, actually before this one, they really also took into their public participation process multiple recommendations from the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group from GC3 that had public participation recommendations. I'm going to highlight those in the next slide or two. Another process we've been going through, which incorporates that equity and environmental justice and equity lens in particular, is our steps for solar development, or here we have our translated, all of our materials were translated into Spanish, so steps para desarrollar solar. And sorry, solar, I don't think it's pronounced as solar. And STEP stands for Sustainable, Transparent, and Efficient Practices for Solar Development. And this process includes stakeholder engagement to identify policies, legislative actions, best practices, particularly related to the procurement, siting, and permitting of ground-mounted solar systems in Connecticut to achieve the following tentative objectives. Again, because this is a proposed objectives, they're going through a public participation process. Ensure that new solar generation projects can be sited and built in a predictable, efficient, and transparent manner. Include consideration of local laws concerning zoning, the environmental, public health, and safety. Avoid or minimize and mitigate to the maximum extent practical adverse impacts on the environment, agricultural, and natural resources. Promote equity and environmental justice through community engagement. Ensure that state and/or ratepayer supported procurements aligned with the objectives above. We had a lot of interest in solar siting through the GC3 process. And we've seen articles nationwide about communities, saying like we want to do this the right way. We have a massive need to invest in renewable energy to reduce emissions. That is going to have impacts on lands and communities. In order for that to be successful, it needs to incorporate the needs of those communities and do that with everyone at the table. And so again, this is ongoing. We're just in the first, really the first phase of this. And there's a lot of need to be able to deploy renewable energy in the state, but we want to do it with taking all of these other factors into consideration. And so, like I said, both of those processes are incorporating the public participation recommendations from our Equity Environmental Justice Working Group. And there's a checklist in their working group report that I really need to kind of pull out of that working group report so people can find it more easily. But I just excerpted a few, their sort of top line 4 guiding principles, and then one example from that checklist for what you can do. I highly recommend using this tool. It's really, I love how they set it up as a checklist. You just read through it and you're like, oh yeah, did I do that? Did I do that? Did I do that? And you will have a robust public participation program if you can check all of those boxes. So their guiding principles were a transparent and accountable decision-making. One thing you can do for that is to provide the public with clear information about the government's roles, responsibilities, and goals. Accessible and inclusive decision-making. Select meeting times that are not in conflict with work schedules, rush hours, etc. If held during meal hours, provide food. These things are, they seem like at face value, of course you would do that, but we hold many meetings historically in government during work hours. And for many years now, not necessarily at the state level, but I previously worked for the feds, where like food was somehow considered a, wasteful use of government money. But it turns out that not providing people with a meal, if you expect them to come to a meeting and provide you their time, is really, a good way to get people to not show up to your meeting. But providing food is a really good way to get people to show up to your meeting and feel like they're welcomed and more at ease. As my colleagues in the environmental justice divisions tell me at Deep, breaking bread together is an important thing that we do as people, and it's a good way to have a conversation. Next is equal partnerships, co-production, and self-determination. Prior to conducting a meeting, form an agenda with the assistance of community representatives. And so it's, again, these are just highlights. There are multiple actions under each of these. And finally, respect efficiency and non-exploitation. Create relationships by collaborating with other government departments and ensure interdepartmental coordination and communication. So community concerns, ideas, and feedback are acted on in a timely and coordinated manner. Meaning, don't just hold a meeting and then never tell anybody what happened as a result of it, because it's, again, not respectful, but ultimately will, result in people not wanting to work with you again. And so it's really important to have that follow-up and have it be timely. And I'm just highlighting here another example. This is something, a workshop that my office is hosting in partnership with the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut on Monday. We haven't been, advertising this as far and wide because it really is a community workshop for the communities of New London and Groton. And, just highlighting here that this is our social media flyer. So social media friendly posting, which is another recommendation that we got from our working group, that, use Instagram, use Facebook, use Twitter, and have it translated into Spanish at a minimum. All right, some more bills. Okay, so switching back to bills. So those are all programs that DEEP is doing to advance mitigation strategies. Here are some bills that made it through session that I want to highlight, particularly focused on equity and environmental justice. Public Act number 21-48, which was proposed as Senate Bill 356, called Establishing an Energy Efficient Retrofit Grant Program for Affordable Housing. And the elements of this bill were to award grants for installing energy efficient upgrades to affordable housing, including housing authority property, and set goals for upgrades for affordable housing units from 2021 to 2025. And I'm highlighting some of the GC3 recommendations under this, again, from the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group, prioritize mitigation of vulnerable communities, and from our Progress and Mitigation Strategy group, building, heating, and cooling, energy conservation. And I will also note that there was some funding sources identified in the bill, which were probably not enough to make a very big dent in what the problem, the needs are. So Governor Lamont proposed, and the legislature accepted his proposal to use American Rescue Plan Act funds to fund this program as well. I think up to I hope I get the numbers right. I think it's 7 and 7. I think $7 million for addressing health health and safety issues in homes that also prevent us from doing energy efficiency services like removal of asbestos, just general repairs, mold, that are particularly problematic in low-income housing. Usually more often find those issues in low-income housing. And if you find them, then you cannot do energy efficiency. So you have to fix those issues first, which are in and of themselves really important to address because of indoor air quality. And then there's another 7 million to actually do the energy efficiency upgrades. Next was Public Act number 21-139, which was introduced as Senate Bill 856, an act increasing representation on the Energy Conservation Board, and its purpose was to increase representation on the Energy Conservation Management Board, including low-income residential customers and municipalities. The Energy Conservation Management Board is the board that makes decisions about how we use our energy efficiency funds that are charges on all ratepayer bills, and contribute to our energy efficiency programs. And I think we had the solicitation for expanding that board already. And so you'll see new members coming on that represent low-income residential customers and municipalities. Okay, so getting on to bills that did not pass, but which were major recommendations of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. This one you probably heard the most about in Connecticut as of late. The Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCIP, which is about reducing emissions from transportation, which is I highlighted in the beginning of this presentation. Our greenhouse gas inventory report shows us that transportation is the largest source of emissions. It's also going up, not down. So if we're going to actually have a chance at meeting Connecticut's emissions goals, we have to address emissions from the transportation sector. And it also turns out that addressing emissions from the transportation sector, greenhouse gas emissions, when carbon comes out of that tailpipe, it comes out of that tailpipe with a lot of other nasty air pollutants as well, particulate matter, NOx, and both of those pollutants exacerbate asthma, or triggers for asthma, triggers for heart conditions, lung problems, are well-established source of air quality issues in Connecticut, particularly for individuals who live along transportation corridors. Hartford and New Haven have some of the highest rates of asthma in the country, and much of that is a direct result of the cars that are driving through those communities in the highways that we built through those communities, running on fossil fuels and pumping out those pollutants alongside a lot of carbon, which is driving greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. So this is a strategy. The Transportation Climate Initiative is a strategy to cap the emissions from transportation and use funding. Sorry about that. I don't know if you can see stuff coming up in my chat. I don't know. To cap those pollutants, and to then use we sell off the credits from capping those emissions, and the sales of those credits, similar to what we do for the regional greenhouse gas emissions program through the electric sector. The proceeds from those sales are what we can then reinvest back into the communities. And when this bill went into the Environment Committee, it was amended in committee. It started off with what was the minimum set by all the states that signed on to an agreement on what the minimum requirements would be to be part of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, of 35% of the investments of those programs going to benefit underserved and overburdened communities. In Connecticut, we set that at 50% in the bill that came out of committee. So there's a significant investment. So we project $1 billion in funding would be raised through this, and 500 million of that would be reinvested in overburdened, underserved communities and things like public transportation, community air quality monitoring, electric buses, electric public buses, electric school buses, bikeable, walkable communities, lots of things to make those communities healthier, and also provide for funding for allowing us to convert more and more of our transportation to electric vehicles and prevent pollution from entering those communities. And another incredibly important bill for addressing impacts of vehicles is the Senate Bill 931, Emission Standards for Medium and Heavy Duty Vehicles. This bill requires DEEP to assess the energy, environmental, and air quality impacts of adopting California's medium and heavy duty vehicle standards in Connecticut. So essentially, California can adopt a more stringent air quality and efficiency for vehicles than the national standard. And Connecticut has always followed California, but we need specific authorization from our legislature to do that. We do not have carte blanche approval to just adopt it once California does. So we go to the legislature and say, this is what we need to do. This is a regulatory standard that will help us meet our emissions goals and clean our air. And but they have not given the go ahead to do that as of yet. And so those are the things we need to do in the transportation sector. Buildings are also a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, and also a major burden, cost of energy for housing, for example, a major burden on our low moderate income communities. And so there's also this bill to propose establishment of energy use building standards for voluntary adoption that would allow municipalities to establish a requirement that new or substantially renovated buildings over 40,000 square feet demonstrate that they use at least 10% per square foot less energy than maximum levels permitted under the state building code, i.e. a stretch code. This is really, so I should clarify, this is really for large buildings. So this is really about bringing down energy use overall. The cleanest energy is energy that you do not use. So energy efficiency is always the best way to go. Do as much of that as we possibly can. And and finally, we weren't able to pass the climate change mitigation and home energy affordability standard, which would require landlords to provide energy use information on their properties and have the option for homeowners to disclose this as well. This is incredibly important because, of course, majority of renters in Connecticut also are low and moderate income and use, disproportionately high percentage of their income to pay their energy bills. And so when they're making decisions about where they're going to rent, again, this is at a minimum to have some idea of what their utility costs are up front when making decisions about their budget for their family. We also hope that could be a motivator for landlords to improve energy efficiency for those properties. And so with that, I'm going to finish and come back on camera here, stop sharing, and take any questions.
All right, terrific. Rebecca, can you hear me okay? I want to make sure.
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm assuming everybody else can. Many thanks for a really comprehensive and timely presentation. I think it was great. And if this had been pre-COVID, we would be serving food now. But I think we're having a great meeting even without it. So let me turn it over to the P2P network to see if you have any questions. I'm going to start with Peter Ludwig. He put in a link in the chat early in the session to a URI Yale.edu program on green infrastructure, so everybody can access that if they need to. But Peter, you put a question in the chat too. Do you want to ask it in person about TCI?
Sure, thank you. Yeah. Hold on.
And anybody else who wants to ask a question, raise your hands.
Yes, I was just curious, just if you could clarify kind of where the Transportation Climate Initiative is at now. Like, what are the hopes for its future? I don't quite understand where that answer, at least. So your insight would be very valuable.
I will tell you that I do not sit at the right hand of Governor Lamont. I am a staff member, so I know, I follow closely what's happening in the news. So I'm kind of just reiterating what, what I'm reading in the news. The Transportation and Climate Initiative, like I said, there's a memorandum of understanding that Governor Lamont signed in December 2020. That memorandum of understanding is ongoing. We continue to participate as a state, as a signatory of that MOU, which is under Governor Lamont's powers to enter into those agreements. But DEP cannot set up the program beyond just being in sort of general discussion with the other states that signed on for planning and to be able to do the program without authorization from the legislature. That is not necessarily the case in some of our neighboring states. Massachusetts does not need that from their legislature. They're just moving ahead. Rhode Island is, I think, somewhere in the middle, although I don't quote me too much on that on Rhode Island because I'm a little less familiar with what's going on in Rhode Island. But I know that Massachusetts is not in the same situation we have in terms of our authority at DEP granted to us by the legislature. But I think that's also why I highlighted the greenhouse gas inventory report. The legislature told us you're supposed to meet these goals and we're not, and transportation is the major culprit. So we're telling the legislature, like, this is the situation. No action means not meeting goals. And so that's what DEEP has been doing. We've been doing that all summer. We've been doing that with the governor. We've been doing that with the reports. And so, doing a lot of education efforts. That's what DEP has been doing about what the program can do, what we think we have to say about it. In terms of the legislature, again, I am not privy to inner workings of the state legislature. So what I've seen reported in the news recently this week, which looks like maybe someone just popped that into the chat, there's a special session that I think is likely to occur, but largely going to be focused on the governor's emergency powers. There was some discussion that special session might include the Transportation and Climate Initiative, bring it back for a vote. It never received a vote in the full Senate. It was passed out of committee. So that's its official bill status, I guess, is that it was passed out of committee. But every bill dies at the end of a session. So next session, it has to be reintroduced as a new bill to get a vote. And so they could bring it back in a special session. That has not been done as of yet, although all things are discussion at this point. There's no official anything. So these are all just things that legislators are talking about in the papers.
Okay, just as a comment on that, Alicia just posted an article in the Connecticut Mirror about this. Alicia, do you want to comment on that?
No, actually, as I was posting it, Rebecca with her ESP powers was referring to it. Okay. So, I mean, you may have other or deeper knowledge, but I had gotten an email. I guess it just was posted saying that apparently they don't have it fully fleshed out yet, which to me means they still don't have the votes. I don't know. It's very much, it seems like a political football, of course, but and they did mention the emphasis on the governor's emergency powers, as Rebecca said. I do have a question though, and since you've called on me, Dean, I'll just go for it. I wanted to ask Rebecca about something I read very recently. It was at the very end of August, and it was an article about Athens, Greece, being the first city on the planet to actually name a chief heat officer. And it was, I don't know if did that cross your radar?
I did. I didn't read the full article, but I saw the headline. Yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah. It is very interesting, and actually, I think the article is popping up in a few different places. I can't find the link and talk to you at the same time, but yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. I think I first saw it in the New York Times, and I thought, wow, now here's a really interesting article that goes into sort of what we all know to be right the issue with urban heat sinks. But I thought that is definitely a proactive solution to designate someone in the government to keep their eye on this, and again, be proactive in planning for the future. And I just bring it up as one of those, again, sort of potential things on the horizon that, you know, maybe something that might be something a city in Connecticut, you know, or maybe is that something that you think will be looked at in the future, just as part of this inevitable warming, you know, and its impacts in the cities?
Yeah, we held a webinar this summer when I thought that sort of heat wave was going to be the major impact we'd see this summer. And then we had one of the wettest Julys on record, even though last July 2020 was one of the driest Julys on records. Welcome to the world of climate change. So we had a webinar about heat waves, and we talked about what our Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection did. And it turns out that DESP, their acronym, our emergency management agency, they started a new protocol this summer for how to talk about heat waves. We had not had one previously, but we've had enough heat events that we have a cold weather response protocol. You may see these alerts on the news. January, February, temperatures plummet, particularly for vulnerable homeless populations, really a big concern. Where temperature gets low enough, the governor says, I'm activating our cold weather protocol. That means we open up warming centers and give people a place to go to shelter because of the extreme cold. We now have the equivalent of that for extreme heat, and we didn't prior to 2021. So that was a new action we've taken at the state to address immediate responses to heat. And so there's a webinar, there's a recording of it on our website if you're interested in that. And we had people from DESP talking about what they do, how the information from the National Weather Service informs us, hey, we're going to have a heat wave, and then that turns into the gubernatorial alert, and then how that works with local public health department. And so we had someone from the city of Hartford talking about how they, as a local public health department, take that information and then how do they turn it into actions at the local level.
Well, that's great. I appreciate that update. I just started this book, Ministry of the Future. It's like 560 pages. It's supposedly like the must read novel for any of us who keep our eyes on climate change. And the first chapter starts with an extreme heat wave in India. And I mean, you're reading it and it's gripping, but it's so grueling to imagine the potential impacts. So that was this morning's what I read over coffee. So anyway, it's good to hear that Connecticut has their eyes on this.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's capturing our attention more and more. Is heat for us. It won't be as hot as some places, but it's a big change for us. It's a big change, you know. When I was a kid, barely anybody had air conditioning. Now it seems like it's a must-have now in Connecticut.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, Kathy, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, again, thank you. This is so much to take in and such a great overview, and so appreciative. I wondered if for many of us on the call whose primary interest is in housing, if you could, give us one or two takeaways about what are the things we should keep eyes on, what should we be working on?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. That is why I highlighted those two proposals that didn't get where we wanted them to go in the legislative session. So one of the things we can do is implement, keep talking with legislators about the need to address energy efficiency in housing. But we also, are able to get some of that ARPA funds and address these issues. So, but that's that doesn't happen within the DEP alone, right? Partners are part of that, getting those programs rolled out into communities, making sure the money gets where it's most needed. All of that is really important to engage multiple partners on. So I think peer-to-peer network is an important resource for how those programs, get developed and rolled out. And so I will help, I can help get the word out through, if you're not signed up for our Climate Solutions newsletter, I can put a link to that in the chat or share it. And, I'll highlight when there's opportunities for public participation there, when there's calls for vendors. Actually, that's something I want to highlight. There's a a new program that we are instituting through the Energize CT program. So Deep's role is to kind of oversee Energize CT. I mean, it's done by the utilities, but we're like in a monitoring and planning role with them in designing that program. And for the first time, they are basically soliciting for local community groups, NGOs to be basically vendors to help get programs out into communities about energy efficiency. And I use the word vendor as a way to be like, this is not a grant. It's not like a grant program. It's like you are, in the same way that we pay consultants quite a bit of money to help roll out these programs, recognizing that local community NGOs are incredibly important to somebody looks like they maybe got the acronym. I don't know, that may be the acronym, the CPE. I think it is. I think it is the CPEI. And so just recognizing that they're part of, that they have an important role to play and should be paid for that work, and are essential to getting it where it needs to go. Yes, that's definitely a community partnership. Thanks.
Great analogy. Kathy, anything more? Your hand's still up.
No. Oh, yeah. I just didn't take it down.
Okay. Well, we're getting very close to the end of time here, and I just wanted to mention one thing to clarify something that you said, Rebecca, about the establishing an EE retrofit grant program for affordable housing. That passed. Is that correct? Or is that still okay? So that passed. I just wanted to mention something that I think some of the members of the peer-to-peer firm we talked about before, but in programs like this, if there is a way to do this, I think it should be explored, which is to look at trying to leverage capital improvements that affordable housing developments are doing anyway. They have a regular capital budget expenditure. I mean, they're probably always partially behind, but they have things that they need to do regularly, whether it's re-roofing, re-siding, new window, whatever it is. Those are all opportunities where they're already investing money. And a little bit, the delta in the increase in the dollars is much less for the improvement that you're going to get, as opposed to going in and re-siding the whole thing from scratch for energy purposes, which a lot of people don't do. So we're looking at that down in New Jersey, and we're looking at it with the US Department of Energy. They seem to be more and more interested in that concept. But how do you layer into a re-roofing job, in a building somewhere in mid-state Connecticut, to make it as energy efficient as you can, and actually save reduce the investment that you're making. So anyway, that's just, I wanted to put that out there as an idea. And then I think
well, I want to respond to that, and I know because it's like 1 o'clock, you guys are wrap up. And because I almost brought some other people from Deep with me today. But like you said, I highlighted a lot of things. I didn't go into sort of deep dive. I was just trying to give you a flavor across the board. Very much encourage you to welcome people from BATP, which I know who are regular speakers, but maybe some more people that can go into depth on more of these programs that I just touched on. Okay. And please have those conversations with them, because I'm in the planning office. I'm not in the how do we roll out this affordable housing development program office. We are also, it's a little confusing. So I know I posted, I don't know if you shared it with the list, but we had posted a job that was called Affordable Housing Office Director. We don't build affordable housing in BTP. It's a program for affordable energy efficiency for affordable housing, energy improvements for affordable housing. We realized that we needed to change some of the minimum qualifications for that, because we recognized, like, we want people who know about affordable housing are really strong applicants for that. But our job descriptions are often written for environmental scientists like myself. And so there was a little bit of a mismatch. And so we're going to be advertising that position again. That person is really going to be leading all these efforts. So I really not only encourage you to be partners, but also encourage you to apply. People from this group may be interested in that position and helping us lead those new programs.
Rebecca, if you share that with us, we'll get it out again. I know that some of that we sent out is, finally reaching people in, like, the other position, the entry level position, I think is closed, but,
we can put it out, yeah.
as the way things go slowly, we're still hearing from people. So sharing those is really great.
Okay, yeah,
That would be
please,
great. Yeah.
please let me know. We're doing a lot of recruiting. We have a lot of retirements happening. There's a lot of recruiting going on for DEEP. So opportunities to join us if you're interested.
All right. Well, terrific. Everybody, please join me in thanking Rebecca for a great discussion and a great presentation over the course of this morning and this early afternoon. We've reached the end of our time. Just a little bit of, there's a couple more things entering into the chat for people who want to check them out before we have to close down. Just to the P2P people who are here, we're now reestablishing the monthly P2P presentation and discussion process that we were doing, sort of pre-COVID and then a little bit during some of the lockdown. And so that's a good thing. And we're back in business for through the end of this fiscal and going to keep doing it. We're beginning to develop a list of the topics. And for the group that's been working on that, Alicia and Paul and Susan, I'm going to suggest that we were going to try and do some of that after this meeting, but I have a hard stop, unfortunately. Maybe we can schedule a get together for sometime next week and just go over, Alicia, what you sent out and Susan and Paul, and maybe get a few others involved, if that's okay with you. I think we'll try to do that.
That works for me, Dean. Yeah, that works for me, Dean. It's Paul.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Paul. Okay. Then I think with that, unless there's any final comments from anybody, and I don't see any raised hands anyway. Again, thank you, Rebecca. It was great. Thanks to all the P2P members who showed up and participated in this. I hope it was useful for you. I'm sure it was for me. And then we will keep you posted on the upcoming meeting about a month from now in October. Yikes. But anyway, okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And that will end the meeting.